So our next presentation is from Betty Garrison, Jesse Akman, and Alison Van Norman, and I will let them take it from there.
Hello, thank you for joining us. This is From Trepidation to Enthusiasm, Introductory Data Literacy Instruction. I'm Alison Van Norman, and I am the Outreach and Marketing Librarian here at Elon, and I'm also an Arts Librarian.
Hello, I'm Betty Garrison. I'm the Business Research Librarian at Elon.
And I'm Jesse Akman, and I am the Science Research Librarian.
Just to give you a little context, Elon University is a private mid-sized university in the middle of North Carolina. Elon is historically a liberal arts school, but now has some growing professional schools. And it's also been recently classified as a doctoral professional school by the Carnegie Classification of Institutions of Higher Education. And as librarians, we see the need to be more intentional with our data literacy instruction with this new classification and with Elon's growing forward focus on research. So Gartner defines data literacy as the ability to read, write, and communicate data in context. So when we think about data literacy and data instruction, we probably first think of courses in math, statistics, and computer science related fields, but knowledge of data and data literacy can be useful skills to have across many different fields and disciplines. So as you just heard, Betty, Jesse, and I are not data librarians. We are instruction librarians from 3 very different areas. So we're going to talk about a framework for teaching introductory data literacy you can easily customize to fit your student demographics and interests. So first, some benefits of data literacy instruction. It will help students to think critically about topics and provide visual clues. Students can now consider numeric data as an information source after learning about data literacy. And it can also lead to immediate discussions based on a visual analysis of the data. Data findings can often be surprising to students, and that can spark some conversation. So when you're planning these lessons, you want to think about what you want the students to be able to accomplish in this one-shot session. You'll also want to think about the data formats that you'll use, and this will be one aspect that will vary quite widely depending on the student groups that you're working with. You'll also need to think about the sources for your data or statistics. And lastly, you'll want to plan your activity that you'll have the students do in class. And Betty will give us an example here that can easily be customized for different students.
Hi, everyone. So every fall, economics majors take a required course. It's called Statistics for Decision Making. And there is a whirlwind ride helping each and every student with their own topic. So they can pick their own topic, and they need 1 dependent variable and 3 independent variables. So as you can imagine, before COVID, this place was a madhouse. As I teach an introductory data literacy course, I don't include working with either response level data or micro data. My goal is to introduce data and statistical sources while creating what I hope is an interest in data and in the longevity of interest in data, while recognizing that data is part of our lives, so why not engender enjoyment and appreciation. I'm trying to include all students, both those students that are going to continue in the data realm and those as a career, and then those who just need a form of data literacy, as most students and all of us do. So I build the introductory course, literacy course around Simply Analytics data visualization tool. It does include mapping. A lot of people think it's just mapping, but what I really want the students to do is to use the thousands of variables they can choose from and manipulate to come to conclusions based on whatever their posited question is. So Simply Analytics allows non-technical users to visualize data relationships by choosing locations and variables. So if you've already used it, forgive me, but it includes locations like block groups, zip codes, states, counties, cities, etc. I find that there's much less trepidation working with data if you're able to choose your own topics. So students have a certain area that they're interested in, and they can use this course, which has a shallow learning curve. And I find that it creates more confidence in those students. So for a data literacy introductory course, the class structure might include an overview of data and statistics. So a data definition, obviously, then how data are created, collected, manipulated, and used. I like to use recent newsworthy data visualizations to get us quickly started. Then we want to explain the authority of the data. We use the CRAP test, or I use the CRAP test. And if you've used that before in your instruction, it's currency, relevancy, authority, accuracy, and purpose. And then, of course, we'll discuss bias and other things that come up. We want to move the students then into the activity as quickly as possible. As you know, students in a classroom, if you go on for 30 minutes, they're pretty bored. So moving right into the activity is really important. So the student activity itself. So you want to choose, you want to do an overview of Simply Analytics. Like I said, a shallow learning curve, get them quickly in there, talking about choosing locations and variables. Then the instructor probably wants to choose the first 2 or 3 variables. And then the posited question that I'm going to ask them at the very beginning of class, this is one of them, is what variable or criteria would you consider if you want to evaluate cities you want to move to after graduation? So saying that in another way, when you graduate, what are the 3 or 4 things that the city must have for you to want to move to that city? So they have a choice when they graduate. Next slide, please. So you can see here, where should I live? So some of the criteria that you might choose to include were the percentage of households with income over $100,000. Now let's be honest, when you graduate from college, you have a huge debt for the most part. So you need to move somewhere so you can actually make a living. My students are economics and business students, so how many occupations are there in this particular area? You could choose other variables. And then finally, the third or the fourth, depending on what you want, is what are you interested in doing when you get there on your leisure time? Do you like to go to concerts? Do you like to watch college basketball? Do you like to go skiing? So in column number 3, and this is a ranking table, you can see that one of the great places to move, obviously, if you like concerts, might be New York City. So at this point, students can then evaluate using the mapping feature or decide to use the chart. So this is the chart. They could also map these variables in a map. As the variables are chosen, students would then review the metadata. So the source of the data it was created, the description, and then make adjustments to their course. And then part 3, we've gone through part 1 and 2. Part 3 is the post-activity discussion. So look at the relationship between the variables and the location. Would you now choose a different place to move based on what you've seen descriptively here in Simply Analytics? How will you think about data differently having actually worked with it? And how was it to make data-driven decisions? So lots of things to talk about after the students have done it. Then you can do another, have them look at another question. So you want to pick 2 or 3 data points to begin, make it small and meaningful, and a student-friendly topic. So that's the way I would look at the class. Let's move away from business and economics and into the arts. Alison will discuss how she uses the class framework within the arts curriculum data instruction.
So taking Betty's outline, there's just a few things that I would change when teaching a data literacy session to arts students. First, when showing the students where to find data sets that fit into their interests, I would emphasize a few different places where you can find data sets that are related to the arts. As Betty was saying, a big part of getting students excited about data literacy is letting them have the freedom to choose something that interests them or that fits into their discipline in a meaningful way. So a couple of examples of places I've found are the National Archive of Data on Arts and Culture, the National Endowment for the Arts, or arts.gov, and the LA Arts Datathon. They all have some downloadable data sets that are really relevant to the arts and to art students. And then I would also de-emphasize the data visualization aspect. I would talk about it briefly, but I would spend more time, since it would probably be a limited amount of time that I would have, I'd spend more time adding in a component of talking about how arts professionals use data in their day-to-day work, just to make the topic more relevant to this group of arts students specifically, and how some knowledge of data and data literacy can help them do their jobs more effectively. And some examples I would talk about would be how they can use data to grow audience sizes and reach out to different potential audiences for theater, music, and dance performances. You can use data for outreach and fundraising efforts, to track your organization's progress, to inform future decision-making for your organization. And you can also use data evidence in grant applications. And next up, Jesse will give his variation for his health sciences students.
Sure. So just for a little more context, like Betty, I'm dealing with students outside the College of Arts and Sciences. Unlike Betty, my students are exclusively graduate students. So that changes a couple of things, right? One is I'm not going to address the kind of foundational concepts of like what dependent variable, independent variable. It's assumed that they know this at this point, right? The other thing is they're in this program where they're constantly being told that, you know, you are being trained for the field. This is a clinical focused program. They do have one research component in order to graduate, but the emphasis is always clinical work. Get out into the field, right? And wrapped up in that is they're being told, we're training you to be evidence-based practitioners. And so, like Betty again, my primary point of emphasis is going to be building their confidence and their comfort with data, because the evidence in evidence-based practice is data, right? So first thing I'm going to emphasize is where they're choosing their data from, because I communicate with them a lot about, you know, this is a resource the library pays for versus this is something you'll have when you get out into the field. Health sciences are pretty unique in the volume of publicly available data, and I want them to go towards those sources like World Health Organization sources or CDC. If they're looking for population level data, they can always go to PubMed. If they're looking at data, if they want to perform something like a meta-analysis, there's lots and lots of there's enough publicly available information in there to make those statistical judgments, right? So that's a big point of emphasis. In addition to de-emphasizing those points about, you know, those kind of more basic concepts of dependent versus independent variables and things like that, I'm going to push them away from the data viz component. I think there's an argument to be made that data viz is a great thing for a clinician to understand, to be able to communicate with, you know, lay people like me, but I don't want to have to split their attention. I want them to focus on finding the data and more importantly, the piece I'm going to add, right, which is that statistical analysis piece. I want them to take large data sets and really start learning about how the evidence in evidence-based practice is generated, right? What are the central tendencies of this data set, right? Or how do I determine the true rate of positives on a test using Bayesian analysis, right? So that's going to be my primary addition, right? Is getting them to do a little bit more with that data than you could reasonably expect a undergraduate class that still needs to learn those foundational concepts to do in whatever the class session is, right? So I want to kind of put everything back together quickly and just give you guys a little sense for why do we think this was valuable? What are we here to do today? And so we gave that definition of data literacy at the beginning because one thing we talked about a lot as a group is this is a type of instruction. Data literacy instruction is something that carries a lot of assumptions, right? Do we come into class and assume our students understand what data are? Do we assume they understand what data literacy is, right? So how can we unpack those ideas without burdening them, without giving them too much information, but without, kind of keeping these things obscure? Another big thing is this idea of less is more. I can't tell you how many instruction requests I've gotten where it's, okay, can you talk about citations and citation managers and database research and all of these things? And, oh, you guys are doing data literacy now, great. No, if you have the kind of relationship with your faculty where you can have these discussions, talk to them about, can we do this over multiple sessions? Or can I send you some asynchronous materials or something like that to make sure that your students don't have to split their attention, you're not overwhelming them. Next is, we've seen that teaching your students to find data is more important than making them understand which data do I need to find or where exactly do I need to go for them, right? There's a body of research that shows that students are more likely to retain this information, to engage in these instruction sessions if the data they're presented with are interesting to them. right? So it's a classic teach a man to fish, not give them a fish kind of situation. And lastly, you know your students, you know your faculty, so all these things that I just presented as kind of rules, treat them as suggestions, right? Maybe your students don't need to focus on finding data, and they really do need to talk about where to find them. Maybe your students can split their attention between data literacy instruction and citation managers and all of those things. Trust yourself, trust the relationships you've built, and trust your students. So thank you for bearing with us, and we'll hear your questions.
Perfect timing, thank you. I think my microphone wasn't cutting in for the warnings. So we do have 2 questions in the Q&A box. So Doreen asks, do you make sure students realize that data is more than just numbers, text, images, etc.?
Well, I would say that given the limited time that we have, we would certainly discuss all the features about data as quickly as we can. And we would talk about data. Well, in my class, I talk about the fact that text is also data and also images along with the data visualization. Now, Jesse might have another feeling about that. Go ahead.
No, I was going to say that a big point of emphasis for me is that when you guys are practicing statistical medicine, and you need to understand that the numbers that you were presented with about there are X percent of false positives from this test does not come from numbers. It's kind of qualitative analysis that you then turn into a quantitative piece. So understanding that relationship is really essential.
Thank you so much. That's a great answer. Michelle asks, Jesse talked about not burdening students. Do you use the term data literacy, or is that a concept that they don't need to learn?
I don't know if that question was addressed to me, but I don't know the answer to that, right? I think that would be a situation where, again, trust the relationships that you've built and your understanding of your students. And I think, if you're somebody like me who works with a graduate student population, I might be more inclined to use that term. But when I work with my undergrads, why add more information, right?
Yeah. And we have been talking about introductory data literacy, so probably we would keep it fairly light for this, for what most of us are talking about. Yeah. Good question.
Alrighty, and I'm not seeing any more questions in the Q&A box or the chat just yet, but we do still have 3 minutes before the next session starts, or before the next presentation. I love all of those. I do a lot of workshops with Simply Analytics. I'm really excited to give that question a shot in my next workshop.
Good.
It's always the challenge, is coming up with a question that will actually engage with students that they'll find useful and interesting.
Using it as there's as many of us all are instructors. There's so many ways to introduce this whole subject that everyone has an idea about how that might work. So maybe the next time we could have a workshop where everybody talks about the ways that they introduce an introductory course. That'd be great.
Yeah. All right. And we do have some questions, more questions popping up. So Michelle asks, could I ask Alison to reiterate examples of how art folks use data?
Yeah, so the examples that I gave were using data to kind of reach out to new potential audience members for performances, outreach and fundraising, tracking your organization's progress, informing future decision-making, and using data evidence in grant applications. And there's a website, I think it's from SMU. They have a data art website, and they have tons of different examples of how you can use data to help you do your arts job more effectively.
Alrighty, thank you. All right, Kalila asks, understanding the time constraints, do you discuss the issue of neutrality and how it relates to data? If so, how? And I believe we have 1 minute left for the answer for this one, if that's not too fast.
I don't discuss the issue neutrality. So I will think about how I might, if that would be important to what we're trying to learn. And I'll go on to the next one really quickly if I can. How many concurrent sessions can you have with Simply Analytics? I didn't mean to cut off the other one, but we're losing that through the North Carolina Consortium, which is very sad. We might have to buy it. And we have, I think, 10, and we can call and ask them to up it for us.
All right, and I believe they just had a feature too where you can have, I think, up to 2 users who don't count towards a quota or something like that. So, all righty, it's 10:40. Thank you so much, Betty, Allison, and Jesse.